Okay, cool. I have the first point. So yeah, I've made a bit of progress on the Dockerization of um, Puma and Action Cable. Uh, I'm not sure. Like, I think I can get this into review today, hopefully, or at least mark it for review. I don't see anything else. I think it's a good first pass. There are a few things that I think we should probably follow up with. One of them is the customizability of it. Like currently, we've set some settings. So, for example, the number of threads used by Action Cable, I've just set to 4. I think that should probably be customizable. But I think it's fine for a first iteration. You can test it by checking out the branch and running Docker Compose up. Once you've installed Docker and Docker Compose, that should be enough. And I'd also encourage you to run to prune Docker images every once in a while, or RIP your hard drive, which is exactly what happened to mine. So cool. So hopefully that goes through review, and yeah, anyone can run it, and that basically unblocks us to hopefully help with the Kubernetes work in some way as well. Cool.
It's also, I mean, I think I mentioned this already once, but it's also very easy to use this branch with the Helm charts. Like you don't need this to be merged to like work on the Helm charts here. Like you can just, because like the pipeline actually builds these images, so you can just fetch those when you're working on the Helm charts. I'll just find the docs and look to that.
You were working on the Helm charts already, right?
Yeah, for something to do with Sidekiq, but yeah. Yes, and I got this wrong, but it's actually very easy. When I got it wrong when I was doing it because I was just trying to run a different version just for the Sidekiq container. But it's much easier to just run the same version everywhere.
So do you know about the nightly builds then? Because at the minute, I'm not sure. It's a bit of a chicken egg problem. We have a new container called Action Cable, which needs to be built locally to start with, so that it can be used by Docker Compose. But then we need to switch it once it starts being built nightly. We need to switch it to use the nightly build.
Let me just have a look at that, Emma. So which container? So the Action Cable container is where's the Docker file? There.
Yeah, sorry for putting you on the spot. Yeah, so the Action Cable container is the new one. But obviously we can't pull it down from a nightly build or anything because it's not built yet, right? So we have to add it to Docker Compose.
Yeah, but I think you could also pull it from the pipeline here, though. Is it in this pipeline? So you see you've got that pipeline running and it builds a bunch of images.
Yeah.
If it ends up in that pipeline, then it will have pushed the image to the Docker registry for that project, the CNG project, with the tag being the Docker tag being the Git branch name. So you can pull it that way as well, which is what the Kubernetes thing would do too.
Cool.
So does that make sense? I think that might be a bit missing from this MR if it's not building. I don't know how you get a new image to build.
I'll add that to the MR then before I put it in for review. It sort of makes sense. I think when I think about it a bit more, it'll make sense.
Yeah, so basically the point of the pipelines here isn't so much to test, well, it is to test them, but it's also so that you have a convenient way of getting the image that's generated by your changes like publicly, so you don't have to build it locally. So yeah, that should be doable, I think.
Cool, thanks. Scott has the next item. I don't know if Donald, you want to read it for him, or maybe you're not here.
Well, I'm here. Let's see. So yeah, okay, the first pass, the front end for assignees has been merged in. He linked to the MR there, and Heinrich, I don't know if you have an update later on the back end, but it looks like that has also been merged in, and both can be tested now with, they're both behind a feature flag. And I'll point to the name of the feature flag. I'll add that to the agenda.
Thanks. So, like, I have one question on this, and it was kind of related to Matthias' comment below this. If you read the summary that he wrote, at the minute, it seems like they're quite tightly coupled. So, if there's a problem with Action Cable, and we can't for whatever reason broadcast the change. Like, so if I assign myself to an issue and we can't broadcast that, the whole assignment will fail. Which means that I don't think there's a way to switch this off at the minute, right?
No, I don't think the assignment should fail. If the feature flag is off, it should just, do the normal thing where it assigns without broadcasting.
Yeah, if the feature flag's off, it won't broadcast. But say there was a problem with Action Cable or with broadcasting, right? So say the feature flag's on, but there's a problem. The exception there will cause the whole assignment of the user to fail rather than falling back gracefully to the old behavior.
I haven't actually checked, but I'm not sure if we do a transaction there and roll back or something like that. But I added it as a after update hook on the issue update service. So I'm not sure if it's part of the transaction and rollback thing, or if it just, gives a 500, but then the assignment actually, happens on the DP.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm not sure. I noticed that originally because I forgot, like it was me, like I forgot to create a cable YAML file, or I hadn't got to that yet. And so when I tried to assign a user, it failed. But you're right, I didn't actually refresh the page, so I have no way of knowing if the actual assignment worked or if it was a transaction and the whole thing was rolled back. I just saw an error. Okay, that's interesting. Like I was just curious. Actually, Matthias, you have the next item.
Perfect timing then. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I don't have like that much to update. It's pretty much all in the issue. But I can quickly talk about what we did. So I mean, it was very kind of researchy because we also haven't really worked with Action Cable before. So what we looked at was so the preferred mode of operation was so far to spin it out in its own instance. So we looked at what does that mean, if how much extra memory would that consume? So we looked at a bunch of different metrics there. Mostly we tried to focus on how much like real physical memory is actually being used. We sometimes over-report memory. If you look at that caused some confusion. Like if you look at the application logs, it will sometimes say, oh, the Puma worker killer, is reporting this and that much memory is being claimed by a process, but it's actually an overestimate because that's really only the process, kind of the isolated process view, and not really what will physically be allocated by the operating system. So we kind of did that breakdown, and it's all in the ticket if you want to have a look at the numbers. What will be much harder going forward is to really, so there will be some trade-off if we want to like reap more memory benefits between having a single configuration that we would run for everyone, or having multiple options, right? So that you can really say, for instance, we want to run basically the web server and the Action Cable server. If we spawn them from the same parent process, there can be memory savings that way, because there's then a larger amount of memory they can share at the operating system level. But that would require more work. We don't have that set up currently, but there was, I think, a pretty promising idea, because there could be a couple 100 megabytes we might be able to save. But it would be something that you really need to explicitly turn on or off, because I don't think this is something we would want to do on .com. So this might be more like an option for developers, and maybe single node installations for Omnibus and self-managed. So yeah, so I don't know if that can be an option, because I think it was Josh that I talked to a little bit about this in another thread, another context. But we're trying to reduce the configuration matrix as well, right? The combinations of things we need to maintain. And if you always have these extra settings that are just being used by a certain portion of the customers, and especially not on .com, then that's always like extra maintenance, extra testing we need to do. So there's a trade-off there, is what I'm saying.
So for GitLab.com, I think we could probably simplify it a bit, because what we would do is we would either be serving WebSocket requests, or we'd be serving HTTP requests. I think what Ben said in a previous meeting is we wouldn't be doing both from the same host.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
That would
under
just
this
be
model, we cannot apply this idea, for instance.
No, but what I mean there is, sorry, that if it's just what services are we starting, then it doesn't matter like what we're forking, because we only end up with one type of process
exactly,
anyway.
precisely.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
exactly.
like,
That's
I think
exactly right.
Okay, right. So we're agreeing. Good. So yeah, basically, I think that yeah, I think that what you said makes sense, and the simplest way is to just like let you turn them on and off, rather than being able to turn them on but with shared memory, or on without shared memory.
Right. So the idea of the sharing memory between processes is really something we can only do if you run it on it really only makes sense for a single node deployment. So that's why .com would not benefit from something like that.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. Like we just need on or off.
Yes.
I think.
Right. Yeah.
And from what I understand from that, Matthias, like I read through that issue and it was really helpful. Thank you. Basically the biggest issue here is just the size of our application in memory.
Exactly.
And it's just another copy of that application in memory. And like
that's exactly
whatever
right.
libraries we're adding are basically irrelevant.
Yep.
Like it's just our stuff.
And to be honest, there is some interesting things we can still look into. That's not even action. So we need to look a little bit at some of these discussions ventured a little bit out of the scope of just Action Cable, because we all know that this is an issue that is common to a lot of stuff we do, right? So what is unclear, definitely to me, and I think certainly other developers as well, is so to what extent, let's assume we would be able to break down GitLab, the app, into smaller chunks that are maybe more organized around features, say, right? Because we know the Action Cable functionality, it will only require access to a certain sub-portion of the whole suite of functionality that we offer. So just in terms of the code that's been written and all the extra data that's being used around the particular features we use, we don't actually know how much that would be. So even if we were now, today, be able to load only modules X, Y, and Z, assuming we had those, let's say the issues sidebar or whatever, we don't actually know how much memory that would require. So that's something we haven't looked into yet. So we don't even know if that would yield any kind of meaningful savings, because it's more likely that the vast majority of memory is just consumed by Rails itself, running and loading all these gems.
And a monolithic Rails app tends to be shared everything can do everything, which means it really, unless the later you wait to do something like that, the harder it is, because you might find out that, oh, actually issues does touch this thing in pipelines or whatever somehow.
And this discussion is really, this is the big architecture discussion to have, right? To what extent do we want to shrink the monolith? And this is not Action Cable specific, because that comes with so many strings attached, right? If you want to install clear context boundaries, and then you need to have a well-defined API between all your feature verticals, that will introduce friction in other locations, right? It slow down development of features, because one nice thing is that now we were able to knock out pretty quickly a prototype for what we want to build, right? Because it is so easy to just access everything directly. So that would come with a cost, of course.
Yep.
And honestly, I don't know how we currently I don't know how to go about this question. How, if you think of memory as a currency, or any kind of resource being expensed, how much of the currency is feature X worth in terms of that resource consumption? I can't say.
No, I think it's an interesting question. Sorry, I think I probably derailed the discussion, but I did find that issue
No, I think
thanks for putting it together.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so that was pretty much it. But if you have more questions, just follow up. Feel free to follow up.
Just to be clear, the issue doesn't make any recommendations for the work that we have in progress at the minute. Doesn't prohibit us from proceeding with kind of Docker and Kubernetes model that we're doing, like the completely isolated, running a whole separate container with the entire app and action cable?
There are no low-hanging fruit. That's what we found. So there was a suspicion at first, but that was based on these misleading memory readings that action cable itself, as in the gem that we load, might actually add significant overhead. It was estimated at first there was an extra 300 megabyte it added, but that turned out to be wrong. So that's something we looked into. So that is not worth looking into. So there's no easy win in terms of, oh, let's just not load like this particular gem or whatever. If we run an action cable server.
And on the Docker point as well, like I don't think, and this is what you've got in your MR as well, John, right? Like the Docker model would never be start a web server and a WebSocket server in the same container. You would always be starting them in separate containers anyway. Exactly. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think as well, like on the sort of broader point, like we should hopefully like save some resources from not needing to do long polling anymore for a lot of things. Unfortunately, that doesn't include the feature that we're releasing first, as we don't do any polling on assignees. But when it comes to things like notes, or even the fact that we poll for real-time changes regularly on the page, I don't know, but it seems like pretty often, we should eventually save that.
Yeah, that polling is pretty cheap, but it's still not as cheap, hopefully, as a WebSocket connection, especially as that connection be shared. But hopefully, I think the idea here is right, that like this would be pretty underutilized initially, but in a way that we could like scale it up fairly easily in future, right? Like the whole point of this is to get some kind of WebSocket thing out there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. There was also the open question, if we forget about like memory consumption for a second, like if we do roll it out as like, if we move this out to Kubernetes, like we would have a bunch of pods running that are just specifically serve WebSocket connections, right? So the question was then, well, how would we support the traffic or the users being connected, listening for updates for a particular issue? How many of these instances will we have to run? So that's still an open question. And I don't know the answer to this. Like I think we had a discussion in one of the tickets about it. I think this is something we have to just test, like, just deploy something, start testing it. And as long as we make sure it degrades gracefully, which it should, right? In the sense that if it would stop working because we can't handle sending as many updates as their users connected, if users, the app will still be as usable as it was before, in the sense that you can refresh and you will still see all the changes, right? So I think that's actually a big benefit that we have here in terms of like how we can experiment with this in production, because it's nothing's really relying on this to immediately just work. So I think we would save ourselves a lot of time if we try to experiment with this on a canary, or like on like a smaller scale rollout in production, and go from there, rather than trying to like estimate upfront how much that would mean in terms of extra nodes deployed. I talked to Nate about this as well, because he was still around until the 30th, I think. And he also said, so basically the restricting factor here is the number, because these are long-running connections. It's really like how many of these users we will have to hold connections open to, as they remain on, like, for instance, the issues page, if they have a browser tab open. And yeah, it's like really like hard to estimate this. I don't know if we even have numbers around, like maybe from usage pings or something, like how many like what is the like time users spend on the issues page, for instance, right? That might be something that might be interesting to look at, but it will be quite difficult to estimate this just based on what we have.
I do wonder if we could maybe count unique requests coming in through the real-time changes endpoint or something, like, even to get a rough idea. I guess if you move to a different tab, that long polling slows down, maybe. And then you could, yeah.
Could it be interesting to look at? I mean, we should be able to figure out how how many updates, how many change requests there are on average for an issue, right? You know, basically at what frequency would we send out these updates, like assignee change and whatever we would send out in terms of events. If we then had an idea of on average how many users might be listening to this, at least we could, you know, arrive at some kind of ballpark around how many connections we would have to maintain.
Yeah, and it is a project level feature flag, so I mean we can switch it on for like a small project to start with.
All right, yeah.
And do a kind of isolated application or isolated rollout.
Yeah, I guess we could have a rough number from counting posts to the, you know, update issue endpoint. Actually, the broadcast we're doing right now is for any issue update would issue the broadcast to make it simpler, because we're planning to do this anyway for the whole issue. So even if you update another part of an issue, it would still broadcast this same event that an issue was updated. So yeah, we have more Action Cable events or messages broadcasted than necessary right now for this initial feature, but yeah.
That's interesting. So yeah, any update to the issue broadcasts this event. It's only that we only listen for it for assignees.
Yeah, I mean, we listen on it for, you know, for that event, and then we fetch assignees even if it didn't change. But what this means is that when we enable this feature for other parts of the sidebar or for the title and description, we don't actually add any overhead anymore or something. It's the same, you know, same.
Cool. Yeah, I have the last item. I don't know what else to say on this. It looks like the delivery team have scheduled the real-time work in Kubernetes for the next thing they're going to work on. So that's great. That's all the information I have on it. They're still working on Sidekick in production, I think. So it may be a while yet, but we'll hopefully have the Docker stuff by then.
Yeah, from what I gather, the Sidekick stuff is like they're moving towards rolling out the Sidekick stuff for more things. So hopefully they're on the downslope for that.
Awesome. Cool. We're nearly at time anyway. I just wanted to check. I know it's kind of selection bias, but is this meeting time? Does this actually work for anyone? Is it for everyone? It seems like we're moving into a stage where a lot more of the back end stuff is done, and we should try to cater for a slightly different audience. So I don't know. Do people like this time, or you want to change it to maybe later, earlier?
Works fine with me, but I believe Scott could attend this meeting because he's on United States time zone. I think specific, right? So it would be nice to move it more to like European evening.
Tough for you though, Heinrich, right?
I could, you know, stay up late once every 2 weeks. So.
I wouldn't build it around me because my schedule is so dependent on childcare at the moment, which is dependent on my wife's shifts, that like whatever I tell you will not necessarily apply every Wednesday. So I'm not going to be any use.
Roger. Okay, cool. I'll follow up.
I think the next discussions would be more about delivery and all that, you know, rolling out thing. So I'm not sure who are the more critical people that we want in the meeting. So.
Cool. All right. I'll schedule the next one for 2 weeks anyway, and I'll move the time if it's more appropriate at that point. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording.